Our scripture reading this morning comes from Romans chapter 2, verses 17 through 24. Romans 2, 17 through 24. But if you call yourself a Jew and rely on the law, and boast in God, and know his will, and approve what is excellent, because you are instructed from the law. And if you are sure that you yourselves are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. You then who teach others, do you not teach yourself? While you preach against stealing, do you steal? And you who say that one must not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, dishonor God by breaking the law. For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you.
Thank you, Lyndall, and thank you, Caleb, for the songs that you led for us this morning. And shout out to Caleb for the part he played yesterday in the service. I threw the difficult songs at Caleb, and he handled them so well, as he always does. So appreciate him for that. It's good to see all of you here this morning. I'm glad that you joined us as we worship our God on the first day of the week, as we are commanded to do. Good to see Brother Joel and Sister Janice here. Glad to see y'all. Love you guys. It's always a pleasure when y'all are able to be with us. Our passage of scripture that we are going to be studying this morning is not the one that is just read for us, so we are going to get to that passage here in a minute. We are actually in 1 Timothy chapter 6 this morning. So if you've got a Bible, find one around you, your phone, whatever you like to use, tablet. We'll be in 1 Timothy chapter 6 for the majority of our lesson, but we will visit several other places, including that passage from Romans 2 here in a little bit. First two verses of 1 Timothy 6 say this: Let all who are under a yoke as bondservants regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God in the teaching may not be reviled. Those who have believing masters must not be disrespectful on the ground that they are brothers. Rather, they must serve all the better, since those who benefit by their good service are believers and beloved. All right, well, it is no secret that when we read that passage that the topic of those two verses is the topic of the master and bondservant relationship, or the master-slave relationship. That word for bondservant, as it says in the ESV, is doulos. That word is translated bondservant, sometimes translated slave, but that is the relationship before us. And that relationship is written about at several points in the New Testament. And the reason that it is written about at several points in the New Testament is because it was a common situation in the first century. You know, Christianity, the writings of the first century dealt with things that were happening in the first century. So, you know, we think about the relationships that exist within a household. We have the relationships of fathers and mothers and parents and children, and those still apply today, of course. But one relationship that was applicable then was a relationship often between the Lord of the house and the servants that existed in the house as well. Now, of course, we live, thankfully so, we live in a society today where we don't have that type of system anymore. We don't have any type of bondservant or slavery system in America. I'm very thankful for that. But when it comes to a passage like this, and there are others, as I said, in the New Testament, we'll look at a few of them. What are we going to do with those verses? We come to some verses, they talk about masters and slaves, masters and bondservants. Do we just chuck those out of the Bible? You know, are we going to just skip over those? I think y'all have figured out by now I don't skip verses when we work our way through books of the Bible, so we're going to deal with them somehow. So what are we going to do with them? Well, I think there's still meaning and application for us today. And here's where I think the meaning is, and this is how it is often applied, I think rightfully so. We may not be a master or a slave today, but we still live in society in such a way that we have people who are, as I've labeled on the screen, over us. Right? They are our superior in some type of way. They have some type of authority over us. And every day we live in the world, and that is a reality. We have in the household, perhaps, you have parents who are over the children, and children are commanded to obey parents. You have husband who is the head of the wife. You have in the church, you have elders in the church, and we submit to their leadership as they submit to Christ, who is the head. In society, we have law enforcement. We have government. We go to work and we have bosses, right? And so every day we live life in such a way as we have people over us. We go to school and we have teachers, and we have the principal, whoever it might be, that has authority over us. And so that's the reality of how we live. And so I think when we look at a passage like this, we can take some of the principles that are laid out here in the first two verses of 1 Timothy 6, and we can apply those to how we are supposed to live and how we are supposed to interact on a day-to-day basis as Christians with those people who are over us, who have some type of authority or superiority over us, wherever it may be. And so the first thing I want us to notice is that we must honor those over us. We must. Now, I want to defend the word "must." Right? We must honor those over us. I say that because the first verse of 1 Timothy 6 reads like this. It says, "Let all who are under a yoke as bondservants regard their own masters as worthy of all honor." Now, the language there in the ESV is, and the King James reads the same way. It comes off a little, I guess maybe softer than the word must, because it says let all do this. But that idea of let all do it, in the original language in Greek, it is an imperative. Right? In other words, we're dealing with something right here that it's not really optional. It's not like, this would be a good idea if you did it. From Paul's point of view, this is a command. We must do this. Bondservants must regard their masters in this way. And for us, I would say we must honor those people who are in authority over us. Right? And we'll, again, I understand that not every situation is as possible, right? For instance, in the book of Daniel, was Daniel someone who submitted to authority? He was, but did he always do it? Not always, right? He still prayed after the law had been made. Why? Because there's a higher authority, right? First and foremost, there is the authority to God. So we got to honor His authority before everything else. But I'm talking in general. We're not dealing with situations where we're being asked to do things that are contrary to the will of God here. So we need to honor those over us in a general sense. And notice that bondservants need to regard their masters as worthy of all honor. Now, what does honor mean? Right? Honor's got two definitions throughout the Bible, really. Well, maybe more than that, but at least two. And we got two here in 1 Timothy. Now, we'll go back to chapter 5. It was a different definition. In chapter 5, verse 1, verse 3, chapter 5, verse 3, honor widows who are truly widows. What would the word honor there mean? Well, it meant that they were giving financial support to those widows who needed that. And we went down to verse 17 of 1 Timothy chapter 5. Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor. And word honor there again implies the possibility of financial means, financial support, honoring in that way. When we get over here to our passage in 1 Timothy 6, how do I know that we're not talking about the same thing? Well, it's logic, right? In what scenario would a bondservant honor the master by paying them? That's not how the relationship works, right? They give their service to them, but they don't pay them financially. So we know we need to be talking about honor in the sense of respect here. So we need to honor those over us. We need to respect those people who are over us in authority. Now, I want to give a couple examples here, then we'll go to these things at several points. First of all, Romans chapter 13 and verse 7. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed. Revenue to whom revenue is owed. Respect to whom respect is owed. Honor to whom honor is owed. And there are some people that are owed respect and honored by the nature of the position that they hold, right? The most popular, easiest example of this to me is the President of the United States, right? That's applicable for us. We don't always have a president that we like in office. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. But they are owed respect and honored by the nature of the position that they hold. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 17. Honor everyone. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the emperor. In other words, he has authority. He is over us. Pay him honor. And notice, I always find it fascinating. Who is the emperor when Peter is writing these things? If I'm not mistaken, Nero is the emperor at this time. This is the same guy who would start persecution of Christians by the Roman Empire. And still Peter is sitting there writing and saying, we need to honor the emperor. We need to give him the respect that he's owed because of his position. Now, let's think about this question. How? How do we give honor to those people who are over us? Here's the first one. We need to submit to their authority. You got to submit. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 and 14. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. Be subject, or in other words, submit. Same idea, same word there. Ephesians 5:22. Think about it again. In the household, wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. How about the same context as our passage in 1 Timothy? Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ. All right, so we've seen the government, we've seen husband and wife, we've seen children and parents, we've seen bondservants and masters. The theme with all of them is submit to the authority that is over you in all those situations. One more, Hebrews 13:17. What about in the church? Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you. Who's he talking about when he says leaders? He's talking about elders in the church. Who else keeps watch over your souls? The elders. They shepherd the souls of the flock. We have a responsibility to submit to their leadership as long as it is in line with the Word of God. So, how do we do this? First thing, we submit to the authority over it. The second thing, we obey well. Obey well. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17, Paul talked about elders, and he talked about those who rule well. They do their job well. Well, the flock, people who, and not just in the church, people who are under the authority, they need to respond well. And sometimes you can obey or you can submit, but you don't do it well. You don't do it with the right attitude. You don't do it maybe with all the energy and effort that you could put into it. So we need to keep that in mind. Colossians chapter 3. I don't have this one on the screen. You'll have to look at it. At least I don't think I do. No. Colossians chapter 3, verses 22 through 24. Colossians chapter 3, verses 22 through 24. Bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters. Listen to this. Not by way of eye service, as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. So you don't just do it for the sake of looking like you're doing what you're supposed to do. You don't just do it to appease a boss or somebody like that. No, you do it with sincerity of heart, out of your fear for the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. You are serving the Lord Christ. That's a powerful idea right there to me. That bondservants, I think we can apply this to anything we do. Let's think about it in the context of your job. That when you go to work and you do your job, you don't just give a service to your employer. That when Steve and Kenny go and they go and do their job, they don't just pay a service to the United States government and to the citizenship of the United States, but that in a greater way that they are doing their work in service at all times, first and foremost, to God. That's just a powerful idea to me. How would I do those things if I knew that I was answering to the Lord? And the reality is I am, and it is from Him that I get my ultimate reward. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 through 8. I've looked at this a couple times. Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart. Second time Paul has done that. 2 different letters. With a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants, as Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Notice that he says he goes beyond the relationship of the bondservant master. What bondservant free? Any good that he does, the reward comes ultimately from God. So we need to do whatever it is well. We need to do it good. And the last thing, how do we do this? How do we submit to this this authority? How do we honor them, as I should say? Submit to their authority, obey well, interact respectfully. This is just a common sense thing, I believe. You can do what the boss says. You can follow the leadership of the elders and still be in the wrong because of your language or demeanor. It is possible to do the right thing in the wrong way. That applies to every situation. So we must honor those who are over us. Second main point, we must represent God well to those over us. We must represent God well. In the middle of verse 1, you have the phrase, so that. Hina in the Greek. So that. In other words, here's a reason. Why is this important? So that the name of God in the teaching may not be reviled. The name of God might not be reviled. As Christians, it's in the name. In the name of Christian, we represent who? We represent Christ. Right? And everything that we do, it's not just about us, but it is about God. I think a lot of us remember when it was real popular for people to have the bracelet or the things that said, WWJD, what would Jesus do, right? In a situation, you want to know how to respond, you ask that question and think about it. Another important one, I think, would be to ask ourselves this. Well, what does this say about my God? If I made this decision and people saw me do it, they saw how I was about to act, or they saw how I was going to do my job, or how I was going to respond to my spouse, or how I was going to act with my parents, what does it say about God? I think that might impact how we make some decisions. Our representation of God is always there, and it can either be positive or negative. Think about the passage that Lyndall read for us before we started in Romans chapter 2. We talked about people who were under the law, and they felt so confident in the law, and they taught the law, but what did they didn't follow the law themselves. They said, do not steal, but they stole. Do not commit adultery, but committing adultery. And the last thing that it says at the end of that, in verse 24 of Romans chapter 2, what did it say? For as it is written, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. They looked at people, the Gentiles looked at these Jews who were hypocritical, who they said one thing, they acted another, and it said, God's name is blasphemed because of the way that you act. That is in every relationship. It's also in the relationships with those who are over us. They know that we are Christians. We represent Christ. And if we don't act like we should, if we don't do our jobs like we need to do, if we don't respect authority like we need to respect authority, then it has a bearing on how they view God himself. But it can also be positive, right? Matthew 5:16, in the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. So it can be positive. If we do good works, if we honor those who are over us, if we do that well, then we can give glory ultimately to God. Number 3, we must represent the faith well to those who are over us. Right? There were 2 things there in verse 1. So that the name of God might not be reviled. But what was the other thing that it said? And the teaching or the doctrine might not be reviled. So it's not just God's name, it is the faith. It is the way of Christianity. You can imagine a situation where someone who's a Christian does not honor the authority over them like they're supposed to. They become unruly, maybe. They're not compliant. They don't do what they are supposed to do. You could imagine the one in authority saying, why would I want to be a part of a religion that teaches people to act like that? We have to remember that. We represent God. We also represent the religion that honors God. We represent Christianity. We represent the faith. Too many times people are pushed away from Christianity and the church more than they are pushed away from Christ. Right? Their problem is not so much with Christ and with God as it is with the church and the people in it. You know, I don't go to church because there's a bunch of hypocrites in the church. We've all heard that one, I'm sure, which, by the way, it obviously has a semblance of truth to it. I mean, we are all imperfect sinners. It was Gandhi who said this, I like your Christ, but not your Christianity. In other words, Gandhi looked around and he said, hey, the things that Christ taught and the way that he lived, that seems pretty good to me, but when I look at the way Christians act, I'm not so much a fan of that. It ought not to be that way. We can do better than that. We need to represent Christ well. We need to represent the faith well. That's possible. In Acts chapter 2, the early church are described in this way. They were praising God and having favor with all the people. They looked at the early Christians there in Acts 2 there in Jerusalem. People who weren't Christians looked at them and said, I like these people. I like the way that they act. I like how they treat one another, the things that they do. Let's think about another relationship. We go back to that husband and wife relationship where wives are commanded to submit to the husband. What about a situation like this where the husband is not a Christian and the wife is? Peter said, likewise, wives, be subject to your own husbands, so that even if some do not obey the word, they may be won without a word by the conduct of their wives. As you honor those in authority over you, if you do it well, there's a chance, whether we're in a household or anything else, your impact can be so great, it can bring people closer to the truth of the gospel, closer to the Lord himself. Lastly, we must especially honor our brethren. Especially. We honor those over us, right? That's the general idea of the entirety of the lesson. We represent God well to them. We represent the faith. But all that is kind of presented in the context of, hey, what if we're dealing with someone in authority over us who is not a Christian? They're not a believer, which happens a lot. But it's also possible that the person in authority, and of course the church is the best example, the person in authority might be a brother, right? And that happened all the time. Masters and bondservants in the church, they were in the same household. They were also brothers and sisters in the church. Think about the example in the book of Philemon of Onesimus, who runs away. He's a runaway slave. He comes across the Apostle Paul by the divine providence of God, and Paul teaches him the gospel. He becomes a Christian, and Paul sends him back to Philemon and tells Philemon to accept him not as a servant, but as a brother. They're servant and master in the home, but they come in to the kingdom and they're just brothers. Right? And that happened. It happened quite a bit, and it still happens today in different situations. Paul says we need to especially honor those who are our brothers. We get to verse 2. Those who have believing masters must not be disrespectful on the ground that they are brothers. It's simple as that. That's the ground. They're brothers. Respect them. Rather, they must serve all the better, since those who benefit by their good service are believers and beloved. I think this follows the pattern of Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10. As we have opportunity, do good to everyone, and especially to those who are of the household of faith. And we have a responsibility to all people in general, to do good, to honor anyone over us. And Paul says, but if it is a brother, if it is a fellow Christian, even more so. You have even more reason to do it. And they're not just fellow believers. Paul said, yes, they're fellow believers, but they're also, the last way he's described at the end of verse 2, described as beloved. We honor people on their ground that they are brothers because they're brothers. We love one another. And it's a special type of love. Jesus said, new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. That was the mark. He said people look at you and they're going to know you're mine. They're going to know you all belong to me. How? The way that you love each other. That's the way that it should be here in the church. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you went to the workplace and you had someone who was, he was the boss over a certain project, and one of the other people who were under him, they were both members of the church. And everybody else on the team, they saw how these two people interacted with each other. And he wasn't, showing favoritism in the workplace or anything like that, but you could tell they had a special bond. They got along so well, and the love that they had between one another, it was just evident. It couldn't be hid. What if it was so strong that people had to ask questions? What if they had to wonder? What if they said, what is it with them? Why do they treat each other like that? How is their bond so much stronger? What if they had to ask about the church? That was what Jesus had in mind. That's what he envisioned and even commanded to us. In Romans chapter 12 verse 10, Paul right there, love one another with brotherly affection, outdo one another in showing honor. Outdo one another. Not literally a competition, but if you're going to compete on something, I guess that's a decent one to compete on, right? Notice how love and honor are connected there. You outdo one another in showing honor. At the same time, you love one another with brotherly affection. They go right there together. That's the same thing we find it in 1 Timothy chapter 6. If someone is a brother or sister, Paul says it's not even a question at that point. You need to love that person and need to honor that person, especially if that is someone who is over us. As a point of conclusion, again, I just want to reiterate that all of us live in this situation where we deal with someone who has authority over us, whether we're thinking in society with the government, with law enforcement, whether you're thinking the workplace, whether you're thinking at school, the home. We all have situations like that. How do we treat the people who are over us? Do we have a problem submitting to authority? I see that problem in our society. People who struggle with submitting to authority. Do we have that problem as Christians? Are you willing to represent God and the faith properly by giving honor to whom it is due? I hope that you are. It might be the case that there's someone here who says, I don't know that I've been treating people, whether it's someone over you or not, I don't know that I've been treating people as I ought to. I don't know that I've been honoring those to whom it is due. I don't know that I've been loving people the way that God would have me to love them. We all struggle sometimes. We're called to a high calling of love. It's a high standard. It's the standard of the Lord. And none of us are perfect at it. If you need the prayers of the church, we love you. We would love to pray for you. We would love to help you in any way that we can. Caleb is going to lead us in an invitation song. If you have any need to respond, I invite you to come while we stand and while we sing.